I didn't choose to disappear. I was erased. As if someone had pressed the delete key on my public existence. I ceased to be the perfect heiress, the exemplary daughter, the woman with a photogenic smile crafted for gala magazines. It all crumbled on a cold morning when my father walked into my room without meeting my eyes, holding a manila envelope and a stone-cold expression. "You're going to rest for a while, Annalise," in silence, "where no one can find you." There was no choice. In less than 24 hours, I found myself with a modest suitcase in hand, a fake name etched on temporary documents, and a one-way ticket to a forgotten village in the northern part of the country, a place that seemed stuck in 1950, where people lived off what they grew, eyed outsiders with suspicion, and didn't even have cell service. The driver who dropped me off didn't wait for the wooden gate to close. I felt like a package returned without a receipt. In the first few days, time dragged like cold mud on my feet. I, who was accustomed to chandelier-lit ballrooms, now shared space with damp wooden walls and silences that screamed. The villagers were curt, sparing with words, as if every sentence carried a cost too high to pay. They didn't know me, yet they seemed to know everything, that I didn't belong on their soil, that my hands had never touched real earth, that my clean shoes and elegant posture clashed with their muddy streets and simple markets. And they were right. At first, everything about me was excessive, too much perfume, too many gestures, too much ignorance. I was ridiculous, trying to pay for favors with polite smiles and large bills. I learned quickly that kindness here was earned, not bought, and that respect was quieter than words. Still, there was something about that place that held me, a raw kind of truth that, though uncomfortable, began to stir something in me subtly. I, who had spent my life surrounded by aides, tailored dresses, and diplomatic dinners, was now washing my clothes in a cement basin and waking to the neighbor's rooster instead of phone alerts. For the first time in years, no one wanted anything from me. And in the midst of that forced insignificance, I began to feel something akin to freedom, a bitter freedom, true, made of exhaustion, calloused fingers, and a dense loneliness, but it was mine. And for the first time, the absence of luxury didn't make me feel poor. It made me feel real. On the third day, I learned that the village, bread was only sold until 8 in the morning, and those who woke later went without. In the city, everything was always within reach. All I had to do was ask. Here, I had to earn even a piece of fresh bread. I started waking earlier, first out of necessity, then out of habit. At first it was just to avoid hunger. Later, it became my small ritual of resistance. Every step on the dirt road, every curt exchange of glances with the neighbors, was a cruel reminder that I was a stranger in their world. Yet, over time, I learned to walk more slowly, to notice details, to listen to sounds I would have previously dismissed as background noise. The rustle of leaves, the creak of gates, the clank of a bucket pulled from the well. I, who had lived amid the clamor of cameras, now found myself surrounded by silences that told more stories than any headline. It was on one of those mornings that I saw him for the first time. He was leaning against an old truck, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, smeared with grease, his face half hidden under the brim of a worn cap. He didn't look at me directly, but I felt the weight of his presence as if I'd stumbled over something invisible. There was a steadiness in his movements, a natural, almost instinctive rhythm, as if every action had a purpose. Unlike the other men in the village, he didn't look at me with disdain or curiosity. He simply kept working. And that, strangely, unsettled me. I was used to glances, to compliments, to attention. But this man didn't lift his eyes from his tools, and perhaps because of that, he was the first to truly capture my attention in months. I returned home empty-handed. The bread had sold out. But for the first time, that didn't bother me as much. That morning, I wasn't just learning the unwritten rules of the village. I was discovering a part of myself that had been dormant for too long, a part that yearned for more than appearances, that craved connections, real, quiet, steady ones, like the figure leaning against the truck. I didn't know his name yet, but I knew somehow he would matter, even if only to remind me what it truly meant to be seen, not as a name, a scandal, or a political promise, but as someone real, someone whole. In the days that followed, our paths crossed more often than chance could explain. Sometimes at the makeshift market in the square, other times near the butcher's, or while I fetched water from the spring. He didn't talk much. He was the kind of man who answered with a nod, a murmured "good morning" that almost dissolved in the air. But I learned to look beyond words. He carried firewood for elderly neighbors without being asked. He fixed fences, changed tires, taught kids how to tinker with their bikes as if sharing secrets. And somehow, he did it all as if he didn't truly belong there either, as if he too had come from another world. That intrigued me more than I cared to admit. Little by little, I started finding excuses to pass by where he usually was. I asked other villagers about names, trades, stories, until I learned his name was Elijah, a widower, solitary, discreet. One of those men who bury their past in silence and live as if they have nothing to prove. And even without speaking a direct word to me, Elijah became part of my routine, like the breeze rustling through the trees, or the smell of firewood at dusk. Sometimes our eyes met for a second longer than was casual. And in those seconds, something stirred inside me, something no headline, no expensive dress, no perfectly posed photograph had ever touched. It was on a rainy night that fate decided to bring us closer for good. The village lost power, and I rushed out to check the shed next to the house where I stayed. I couldn't see anything. I slipped, hit my shoulder hard, and without realizing, twisted my ankle. I tried to stand, but the pain was sharp and cruel. When I thought I'd be stuck there for hours, a flashlight beam cut through the darkness. It was him, Elijah. Without a word, he crouched beside me, checked my ankle with care, lifted me with gentle firmness, and carried me in his arms back to the house. And there, in the dim glow of a lit candle, as he improvised a bandage with a calm that disarmed me, I understood something with painful clarity. I wasn't just hiding in that forgotten village. I was being found, not by him, but by myself. I had never been cared for like that. There was a silence in Elijah's hands that said more than any rehearsed speech from the men of my past. He didn't ask me anything, didn't pry about why I was there, didn't question the name I carried or the secrets I hid. He just helped me sit, wrapped my ankle in a clean cloth, heated water, and left a mug of tea by my side, as if he already knew exactly what to do for a woman who didn't know how to ask for help. And then, without ceremony, he left, as if he hadn't done anything remarkable. But I sat there for hours, staring at the steam rising from the mug, trying to understand why that simple gesture had unraveled me more than all the criticism I'd faced in Washington's grand halls. The next day, despite my swollen ankle and the pain throbbing with every step, I dragged myself to the window just to see if I could spot him again. And there he was, chopping wood by the workshop, as if nothing had happened. But when our eyes met, something was different, a lingering silence, an unspoken respect. He didn't wave, didn't smile. But I saw in his eyes a kind of care no one had ever shown me. Unhurried, without agenda, expecting nothing in return. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the urge to approach, not to conquer or impress, but to listen, to hear the sound of someone who lived beyond appearances. In the days that followed, Elijah started showing up more often. Sometimes he left a bag of fruit at my door. Other times he knocked just to ask if I needed firewood or ice for the swelling. Little by little, I began to wait for him, and more than that, to wish he'd stay. Our conversations were short at first, sentences about the weather, the village, repairs, harvests, but there was a rhythm to them, a kind of silent dance between two solitudes beginning to recognize each other. I learned he'd come from the south, that he'd lost his wife years ago in a car accident, and that he hadn't loved anyone since. And he, slowly, began to see that I wasn't just the well-dressed woman from the city, that there was something wounded yet alive in me, something that endured. One afternoon, we sat under a tree on the hilltop, where the sky felt closer and time moved slower. He told me about the dreams he'd abandoned, and I, for the first time, spoke honestly about who I was. I didn't mention my last name or the scandals that had banished me from the world I knew, but I talked about what it was like to grow up without freedom, how everything around me had always been decided by others, and how I'd lost myself along the way. Elijah didn't interrupt. He just listened, with the patience of someone who knows some pains need space to breathe. And when I finished, he simply said, "You're stronger than you seem." That was all. But it was enough to crack my chest open like never before. That night, as I walked back home, I realized my exile was turning into a choice. I was no longer there by force. I was there because I was beginning to see, in that forgotten place, a new way to live, and perhaps a new way to love. I knew I was crossing an invisible line, the kind you don't notice until it's too late. Every time Elijah appeared at my door, every time his hands brushed mine as he handed me a basket, every time he lingered a little longer looking into my eyes, instead of turning away, my heart slipped further. It was as if I were learning the language of another time, another world, where nothing was said in haste, and everything was built with silence, gestures, and presence. And the more I let myself be touched by it, the harder it became to hide who I truly was. I thought I could keep the past locked away, that the version of me, the Prescott daughter, the girl of scandalous headlines, the woman on the run, could stay buried in the big city while I was reborn here, in this village, as an ordinary woman. But the world has a cruel way of dragging everything back to the surface when you least expect it. The first sign was the arrival of a black car, the kind with tinted windows that stood out like an open wound in a simple place. It parked at the village entrance and stayed there for hours. No one got out. No one left. They just waited as if they knew. Sooner or later I'd show up, Elijah noticed. He didn't ask, but I saw it in his eyes. The same unspoken question. "Who are you? What are you running from?" He began to pull away, little by little, with the same gentleness he'd approached me with. He still showed up, still helped, still smiled with his eyes. But the time between visits grew, and the space between our words did too. I felt the trust we'd built, even without promises, was threatened by something he didn't yet understand, and the truth gnawed at me. I wanted to tell him. I wanted to look into his eyes and say, "I'm that girl from the papers, the one everyone hated without knowing, the one who fell for a mistake that wasn't just hers." But part of me clung to what little anonymity I had left, terrified that, if he knew my name, Elijah would see me differently, like everyone else had. It was on a cloudy afternoon that everything fell apart. I was walking toward the market when I saw Elijah standing in front of the black car. The men were talking to him, showing him a photo. My face, not the one he knew, bare of makeup, without armor. It was the Annalise Prescott of the press. Perfect hair, rehearsed smile, cold eyes. I saw him look at the paper, then at me, a few steps away. Our eyes met, and in that moment I knew the veil had fallen. He didn't say anything. He just lowered his head and walked away, as if each step took a piece of me with him. I returned home with my heart in shards. The village felt colder, quieter. The glances I'd learned to ignore were back, as if they knew what everyone now knew. I wasn't one of them, I never had been, and maybe I never could be. It rained endlessly. Not a fierce or violent rain, but one of those that seems to weep with you, fine, constant, melancholic. I spent the next few days locked in the house, pacing in circles between walls that once felt liberating and now seemed to close in on me. The village ignored me as it had before, but now the silence tasted of rejection. I was, once again, what I'd always been, the outsider, the intruder, the Prescott, and for the first time since arriving, I seriously considered packing my bags and disappearing again, this time by my own choice. But what hurt most wasn't the neighbors' indifference or the whispers that now followed me down the streets. What tore me in two was the void where Elijah had been. He didn't come back. He didn't leave baskets at my door. He didn't pass by my window. He didn't seek me out. I couldn't blame him. I had lied. I hid who I was. He had offered me the most precious trust, that of someone who lives by simple truths, and I, even without malice, had shattered it with my silence. But I also knew that if I left now, I'd not only be running again, but losing the only true thing I'd ever had. On the 6th night I gathered my courage. I walked to his house through the icy drizzle, my heart pounding, not knowing what I'd say. I didn't bring rehearsed apologies or empty promises. I just knocked on the door and waited. When he opened it, the world seemed to pause for a moment. He looked tired. His eyes were sunken, his face closed off, but he was still him. Elijah, the man who carried me in his arms without asking questions. The man who listened to my truths without demanding context. I took a deep breath and said only, "You didn't know who I was." But what we lived here was real, and it still is. If you look at me now and tell me it's over, I'll understand. But if there's still a part of you that recognizes the woman behind the name, then tell me, because I'm here, for the first time, by choice. He stayed silent, a long, dense, heavy silence. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, as if every second were a verdict. And then, with a painful slowness, he stepped aside and opened the door. In that moment I knew that not all truths need to be shouted. Some are enough to be felt. Returning to Elijah's arms was like crossing an unsteady bridge. The fear of collapse still pulsed in me, but each step was a relief, as if I were returning to a place where my soul already lived. There were no immediate declarations, no forgiveness poured out in pretty words. There was silence, closeness, long glances and small gestures that said, "I'm still here." And that was more than I'd hoped for. The first nights I spent by his side again were simple. Hot tea, hands entwined, breaths in sync. And that was exactly what I needed. For the first time in my life, I wasn't living a fabricated script. This was real, intimate, raw. But the world doesn't easily forget a Prescott. The calm didn't last long. Soon my father made his presence known, not in person. He'd never dirty himself with the mud of that village, but through a polished lawyer and a blunt message. Annelise's silence has an expiration date. The press is digging, and if she doesn't return, the story will get uglier than it already is. It was the final warning, the last chance to fix the narrative. I had to choose, return to my life of appearances and constraints, where everything was controlled and suffocating, or stay in this forgotten village, where I barely knew what I'd eat tomorrow, but where, for the first time, I was free to be. Elijah didn't pressure me. He never did. But I saw in his eyes the anguish he tried to hide. He knew I was being called back to the world I was born into, a world he'd never understand or want to be part of. And it was that difference, that both united us and threatened us. I spent sleepless nights sitting on the edge of the bed, staring into the darkness and reliving every moment I'd given up pieces of myself for obligations imposed on me. And then I realized I could no longer live by others' choices, not even out of family loyalty, not even out of fear. My place was no longer where my blood placed me. It was where my heart beat strongest. The next morning before the village woke, I left a letter for my father. Short, direct, final. The Annalise you created is gone. The one living now is someone else, and she's not coming back. Then I went to Elijah's workshop. He was leaning against the old truck, hands dirty with grease, a worn shirt clinging to his chest. When he saw me, he didn't speak, but he straightened as if he already knew. And then, with a steady voice that had saved me so many times from my own chaos, I said, "If you still want me here, I want to stay. Not because I have no other choice, but because this is the only place where I feel alive." He didn't answer right away. He just stepped closer, looked deep into my eyes, and touched my face with a tenderness that undid me. And then, in a whisper only we could hear, he said, "I've waited my whole life to find someone who'd stay, even when they could leave." In that moment I understood. The exile was over. The running was too. I was no longer the fallen princess in disgrace. I was the woman who chose love, in a place where no one believed it could grow. And it was there, in that forgotten village, that my name lost its weight and my heart found its home. Years later, sitting on the porch bench with grayer hair and skin marked by time, Annalisa holds a coffee mug and watches Elijah working in the garden, now, with a grandson on his shoulders. She smiles, not for the past she left behind, but for the future she built, with deep roots and choices that were all her own. The former princess, once a symbol of scandal and weakness, became a symbol of courage and love. And no one in the village remembers the headlines anymore, only the sound of her laughter at dusk, and that is all that matters.